Good afternoon, members of the audience and special guests. Before we begin the proceedings, and on behalf of all those present, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands our city campus now stands. I'd also like to pay respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. This session will now be recorded. We'll record audio, screen share, and our presenters. We'll not be recording any video input or audio from you. Welcome to all UTS students, staff, and all friends of ACRI and UTS. My name is Michael, and I'm Project and Research Officer at the Australia-China Relations Institute, ACRI, at the University of Technology, Sydney. UTS ACRI is an independent, non-partisan research institute established in 2014 by the University of Technology, Sydney. Chinese study centres exist in other Australian universities. UTS ACRI, however, is Australia's first and only research institute devoted to studying the relationship of these countries. UTS ACRI seeks to inform Australia's engagement with China through research, analysis, and a dialogue grounded in scholarly rigour. If you wanted to explore more about the Australia-China relationship, more details are available on our website at australiachinarelations.org. Today, we are here to discuss the trajectory of Australia's trade relationship with China. UTS ACRI Director, Professor James Lawrenson, will moderate an in-conversation style discussion with Diane Hu, David Yuan, and Jeffrey Wilson. Audience questions are welcome at the end. Now a little bit about the speakers. Professor James Lawrenson's academic research has been published in leading scholarly journals, including China Economic Review and China Economic Journal. He also provides regular commentary on contemporary developments in China's economy and the Australia-China economic relationship in such publications as the Australian Financial Review, the Australian, the Sydney Morning Herald, and South China Morning Post, amongst many others. Dr. Diane Hu is Assistant Professor and Deputy Director of the Australian Study Centre at Beijing Foreign Studies University and Deputy General Secretary of the Chinese Association for Australian Studies. She's the Deputy Chief Editor of Australia Blue Book, China's leading annual Blue Book on Australia, and sits on the editorial board of the International Australian Studies Association, Journal of Australian Studies. She's also Associate at the Centre for Contemporary Chinese Studies at the University of Melbourne. Dr. Hu is on the Board of Experts for China's National People's Congress, advising on the English version of laws passed at the National Legislature. David Yuan is non-resident fellow with the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney and a regular contributor to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's website, The Strategist. He led the Australian's Canberra economic coverage for 15 years and was the newspaper's economics editor from 2012 to 2018. He is author of several books, including Takeover, on Australia's foreign investment policy, and The Kingdom and the Quarry, about the tensions in Australia's economic relationship with China. Dr. Jeffrey Wilson is the head of research for the Perth US Asia Centre, an independent think tank dedicated to fostering stronger relations between Australia, the US, and the wider Indo-Pacific. He has consulted for government and businesses in Australia on trade policy issues and has contributed to a range of national and international policy dialogues involving the US, China, Korea, Indonesia, India, and Australia. He is the author of 2 books, over 24 scholarly articles and chapters, and a wide range of policy analyses and reports for both Australian and international audiences. He is also a faculty member of the Asia Research Centre at Murdoch University. I'd now like to welcome Professor James Lawrenson to introduce the discussion.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that introduction. Look, it's fabulous to be with such 3 outstanding panelists today. Today, I guess we're going to be talking a lot about recent developments, how things might have changed this year. But just to put that into a bit of historical context, it's probably true to say for a long time, the discussion in Australia about economic ties with China were really focused on the opportunities and benefits. That said, the idea that those economic ties could be a source of risk certainly isn't new. In fact, shortly after China switched to becoming a net importer of resources and energy products in the mid-2000s, quite quickly, soon afterwards, you had commentators in Australia voicing concern that China might weaponize those trade and investment links to potentially punish Australia over political decisions that Australia made that Beijing did not like. I remember back to 2013, the Lowy Institute, for example, commissioned our University of Sydney academic, James Riley, to write a report on that very topic. Professor Riley concluded that the risk was exaggerated. He said, for example, that yes, Australia sold a lot of its iron ore to China, but China was equally dependent on Australia as a supplier of iron ore. But the fears didn't go away after Dr. Riley's assessment. In fact, they became louder. And part of the reason for that was that Australia's exports to China didn't just stay in the resources and energy space. We started seeing vigorous trade in agriculture, services. These are the sorts of goods and services that China potentially could get from a number of other suppliers. So, for example, in 2016, we had Peter Jennings, the Executive Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, provide this assessment. Let me just read it so I get the quote right. He said, 2016, remember, we've never had a greater dependency on any country. The risks that creates for us is if Beijing wants to adopt politically coercive policies, it's in a fairly strong position to do so because of that level of trade dependence. Now, that said, 2016 wasn't particularly a time of high political tension between Australia and China. In fact, we were probably more busy celebrating the free trade agreement struck in December 2015. And indeed, in 2017, Rory Medcalf, the director of the National Security College at the Australian National University, in a paper warning about the potential for Chinese economic coercion, nonetheless conceded that, and let me quote Professor Medcalf, even where Canberra has seriously annoyed Beijing, such as by supporting legal rulings on the South China Sea, Beijing hasn't directed economic pressure specifically at Australia. Now, I think since 2017, the landscape has shifted. This year alone, it's hard to keep up with all the developments in the trade and investment space. Many of our audience would be familiar with Chinese actions taken against beef, barley, cotton, coal, students, tourists, and so on. And the political relationship is certainly at the lowest ebb since diplomatic ties were established back in 1972. So to kick us off in this discussion, let me first go to you, Jeff Wilson in Perth. Jeff, you're 3 hours behind us. I guess you've just had your morning orange juice.
Yeah, certainly have, James. Welcome from the cordon sanitaire that is the Republic of Western Australia this morning.
Great to have you with us, Jeff. Look, Jeff, I'd like to put a question to you that's homing in on the trade relationship. Of course, you're qualified to talk in the investment relationship as well, but let's just start off with trade. You've got a reputation for being as someone who comes at these issues very straight up, not particularly from any particular angle. Now, I noticed which is to your credit, by the way. Now, I noticed in a commentary piece in your state's leading media outlet, The Western Australian, and not so long ago in August, you didn't hold back. And so that's why it struck me. I guess it stood out for me because I know the sort of person you are and you don't rush to conclusions. But in the introduction to this commentary piece, you did not hold back. Let me quote what you said. First sentence, Australia's farm sector is being punished by the Chinese government. As diplomatic relations between the countries have deteriorated, China has weaponized trade links to impose politically motivated sanctions against Australian agricultural exports. There's no hedging there, Jeff. You're quite clear on your assessment. So I guess I wanted to begin by asking you, have the events of 2020 really led to a step change in your assessments of where the trade relationship between Australia and China is at? Should we now just expect the prevalence and severity of Chinese actions against Australia to accelerate in the years ahead? And I'm guessing you do think there has been a step change. And if in that case, what's really stood out to you as being the key data points that have crystallised that assessment in your mind?
Thanks, James. And look, I do pride myself on moderation in commentary, which is we don't have a lot of in the Australia-China debate at the moment. But look, I do think that we have seen a pretty unfortunate step change in 2020. And to understand why that is, let's just think for a second about a broader context within the relationship. For probably about 20 years now, the Australian and Chinese governments have managed to erect a very important firewall between their political relationship and their economic relationship. It probably dates back to the Howard government and was expressly designed to deal with the fact that there was a very strong mutually beneficial trade, investment, movement of natural persons as well, a whole lot of things on the economic side. But given the pretty obvious differences in the country between their domestic circumstances, their institutions, their outlooks, their regional relationships, it would kind of be impossible to believe that there would never be political frictions between the governments. So this firewall was erected so we could have that in one track, but we could do the trade and investment stuff on another track, and never the twain should leak across. And look, as you said, we've had, for the last 20 years, we've been doing this, and there's some tension between the governments, and the commentariat fires up, China might stop buying this, or Australia might knock back this investment. And it had been the dog that hadn't barked. The thing that worries me this year, and why I think there has been a step change in 2020, our corona crisis year, is because that firewall has now got a hole in it. We have seen a number of Chinese trade measures. I'm sure the audience on this call has read far too much about them, but coal, barley, beef, wine, tourism, students, cotton, a purported hit list that was sent around in the Australian Financial Review, all of this kind of stuff. And for balance, let me be clear, there's been retaliation on the Australian side as well. Some foreign investment approval decisions being made, other commentary around investigation into subnational arrangements, which is clearly targeted at China's BRI MOU. And so I think what we're seeing is this year, the gap, the thing that kept the politics from spilling over to the economics has got a hole.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. And I share the assessment as well. I mean, that's one of my observations as well. Even in 2017, up to this year, it was always possible to say, yes, the political relationship is deteriorating, but the spillover has been very limited. That does seem to have changed this year. So thanks, Jeff. David, I might go to you next. Now, you're another person, to be frank. You could talk very convincingly and freely and authoritatively about the relationship as well. But I thought I might home in on the investment relationship with you. And that's something I know you've written on extensively in the past. When we think about economic ties being used to respond to political disagreements, we typically, in Australia at least, I think, we think of ourselves as the victim, and China is the one doing the aggressor in the bilateral relationship. Now, I noticed a piece you wrote for the Australian Financial Review in June that was interesting, because you certainly recognised those trade issues that were, responding Chinese actions directed at Australian exports, but actually for more of that piece, you focused on Australian investment decisions. And so I wanted to ask you about that. For example, you particularly cite, and I'll just refer to my notes here so I get the facts right, you referred to a recent Australian Foreign Investment Review Board decision to reject the Chinese purchase of a 12% stake in a lithium exploration company. Now, 12%, I'm not saying it's insignificant, but it's not exactly bordering on a majority stake. So I understand why that may have stood out for you. And of course, more recently than that, we had the decision by the Treasurer to block the sale of a drinks and dairy manufacturer, already owned by a Japanese company, to a Chinese one. So that certainly raised my eyebrows. And one other point I'll just like to draw out from your article is that you noted that for China, the free trade agreement struck between Australia and China was really about investment. So Australia was excited about it because we got to see China lowering tariffs on Australian exports. But for China, investment was a big part of the attraction. So can you perhaps start off by giving our audience an overview of what's been taking place in the investment space. As Jeff said, I think we're all familiar with the beef, barley, coal, cotton, and so on. We're perhaps less attuned to what's been happening in the investment space. And then after running through what we have been seeing, are you seeing a step change as well, where the prevalence and severity of Australian measures directed at Chinese investment, there's been a real step change this year, and we should expect that to continue in the future?
Well, thanks, Jeff, and James, and hello to everyone. Yeah, look, I think there has been a significant shift. It's been coming, though, it's been building for some years. Under the Abbott government, there started to be there was a review of the foreign investment review legislation. In the wake, then, under the Turnbull government, of the controversial lease of the Darwin port to a Chinese company, you had things like the critical infrastructure established, and what one started to see was the intelligence services, ASIO in particular, having a much greater say in the foreign investment process, in the approvals process. And I was struck by, I think it was the 2018 ASIO annual report, which referred to the fact that the Treasurer had been appreciating the advice that ASIO had been giving on the unquote, the foreign investment threat. So, we'd started to sort of see foreign investment at official circles as a threat, really for the first time, I think, since the Gorton government in the 1960s. But this year has certainly brought a step change. With COVID, one of the first things that the government did was reduce the threshold for foreign investment approvals down to zero. So all foreign investments had to run past the FIRB, and the ostensible justification for that was that we didn't want companies buying up, foreign companies buying up Australian assets on the cheap while we were suffering from COVID. And it was under that legislation that the Treasurer blocked a couple of really tiny Chinese investments in the critical minerals space, something that both Jeff and I have done work on in critical minerals. But there is plainly Chinese interest in that sector, strength in that sector, and I think my conclusion was, from the blocking of those small investments, was the Australian government had made a decision that there will be no further Chinese investment in the Australian critical minerals space. Well, then just the final point really in the tightening of the I guess the anti-China focus in our foreign investment treatment has been the new security legislation, which introduces a new test for foreign investors. While we still retain the notion that foreign investment should be supportive of the Australian national interest, or certainly should not jeopardise it, we now have a new test that if an investment is affecting an asset that is of national security significance, it must be approved by the FIRB with zero threshold. And this is really the means whereby the government will be able to make sure that Chinese investment is not allowed in resource areas, in infrastructure areas, and really it's quite a broad scope that it now has to stop investment. So I think we've got a whole legislative apparatus that's being generated specifically around putting curbs on Chinese investment in Australia.
Thanks, David. Of course, we've been seeing Chinese investment numbers into Australia sort of falling since 2016, but I think the consensus is that originally in 2016-17, that was mostly about capital controls on the Chinese end. But it sounds to me from what you're saying now that we're seeing, a significant part of that reduction in Chinese investment is because of restrictions being enacted at the Australian end. Is that, just as a quick point, is that a reasonable summary?
I think we will see declines in the future. The latest ABS numbers still show a reasonable level of Chinese investment come down, but I would expect you will see further declines.
Okay, thanks, David. Diane. Now, I've hit Jeff with a trade question and David with an investment question, but because I know you're particularly talented, I'm going to invite you to comment on both trade and investment issues. So look, I'd be really keen to hear your take, Diane, on what's been unfolding in 2020. You and I are both economists. I think it's been comforting for us over the last couple of years to be able to say, even as the political relationship was deteriorating, well, at least the economic relationship, at least the trade relationship, was still going strong. That gives some ballast in the broader bilateral relationships as there are the inevitable ups and downs that Jeff talked about. But in your assessment, have things really changed in this year? And I'd be particularly interested in any reflections you had from as someone who's based at Beijing Foreign Studies University, some observations that may be missed by many Australian commentators.
Thank you, James. I try my best to multitask. And as you know, I'm also a huge fan of the ballast theory, not just because it can secure my job. That's a very important part of it. But another part of it is that I've always believed in the power of the people-to-people connections. But I think what has been going on in Australia is that we have been emphasizing too much on one side of the story about how you would moderate the ups and downs of bilateral relations. I think something that is really important, especially when you look at from the thinking and messaging of the Chinese government, is that this is an important assumption on the part of the Chinese government. And you can call it an assumption underlying, or then accompanying that, you would see anticipation that the economic complementarity and interdependence between the two countries would be all the more reasons for the two countries, to remain at least slightly more open-minded, showing more goodwill, more compassionate, more empathetic when it comes to other issues. So I think, at least my observations that the Chinese government, or from the Chinese side, that assumption has been challenged, seriously challenged, or even dismissed. So I think what we are seeing, if I can just summarize the situation right now, is that what David said in the June piece, I totally agree with that, is that trust is gone. And also we see this anxiety on the Australian side and also disappointment on the Chinese side. So what we have seen is pretty much a backlash to all that. But having said that, I'm not going to predict a decline of the economic activities, because as we all know that really with trade in particular, there are far more factors that can be instrumental in the final economic numbers. And really the Chinese market is too big.
Okay, thanks, Diane. It's interesting, though, that you do detect a shift from the Chinese side. So I think that's an important observation. Diane, can I quickly follow up with another question? And this broadens away a bit from the Australia-China economic relationship. Sitting here in Australia, the only type of economic coercion we hear about is coercion coming from China. Now, I'm very conscious that if you're sitting in Beijing, the world is very different. I mean, there is no doubt, for example, that China has been a victim of economic coercion in recent years, particularly that coming from the United States in some pretty sensitive areas too, such as semiconductor technology, for example. So look, with that observation in mind, I was keen to hear your take on, given that China's on one hand, in that context, China's a victim of economic coercion, Do you think that makes China less likely to engage in coercion against other countries? That is, it wants to clearly differentiate itself from the United States as a country that doesn't use weaponize economic links. Or on the other hand, I can also theorize in my head that it might go the other way. That is, China sees the United States using economic coercion and simply reasons, well, that's just what big, powerful countries do. And so now we, China, are a big, powerful country, so now it's our turn. So they might be more likely to employ coercion. Look, it's a big question, and I'm certainly not asking you to speak for the Chinese government, but I'd be keen to hear your reflections.
Thank you, James. So the camera, the video is freezing a little bit. So I just want to make sure that you can hear my voice, all right?
I can hear you just fine, Diane.
Okay, great. James, first of all, I'd like to thank you for pointing out, and because not many people are talking about it here in Australia, that China has been on the receiving end of the economic coercion. Just look at the phase one agreement, look at the full details. You know what we are talking about. But I'm not sure I would define everything that has happened as coercion, because I think setting the whole discussion, that framework can be self-restraining from the start. But I would definitely appreciate you capturing, very importantly, this cause and effect connections between all the incidents. And I think this is really important. And I would like, if I can, just add one more thing to this. If we just step back from all this discussion, debates about economic coercion, step back and look at it from a longer time span, I think we have to admit that globalization does have losers. And when we talk about all these trading numbers, it can be good, and then at the same time, it's bad for other segments in a certain part of the world. So what I can see, at least, is that there are many segments in the Chinese society that have fallen victim to this process as well. So that's why the trade minister in China will talk about all of these trade remedies investigations Australia has launched against China since the diplomatic relations started. And also, this would bring us back to the trust and goodwill thing. If the trust or goodwill between two countries is there, I'm sure that there's always room for consultation or negotiation. But without it, it would definitely be difficult.
Thanks, Diane. Yeah, that's important to observe, isn't it? For all the prominence, with a lot of justification given to coercion, it's not the only factor. Well, I think we can all agree on that. It's not the only factor at play. Just as Australia has many more anti-dumping actions in place against China. In the sense, it's not surprising that there might be a few that China is applying in the opposite direction. Jeff Wilson in Perth, back to you. Look, Jeff, you've observed that there's been a step change in the trade relationship. And this is where we might be headed into the future. So if that's the case, then it seems to me that mitigation really does become the name of the game. This is where we're at. We've got to mitigate the risks. So I've got a two-part question, but here's the first part. When you look at Canberra in terms of public policy, and when you look at companies in terms of their corporate risk management strategies, do you feel confident that both groups are accurately pricing risk? And I guess what I have in mind there is, it's easy to underprice risk, of course, and just be complacent and imagine everything will continue on as it was 3 years ago. But of course, there's also the other danger of exaggerating that risk. That's not what we want either. What's your assessment of where Australia's at in terms of accurately pricing that risk going forward?
Thanks, James. And I think something that we need to think about in national discussion here, because as that firewall's broken down, we need to have more risk pricing discussions than we have in the past, is actually working out risk and cost for whom here. And how is that distributed within Australia? Let me use the barley anti-dumping dispute as a case in point. Now, the exact value of the cost to this depends a little bit on prices and how the harvest over here goes in the next couple of weeks. But A good estimate would that probably going to wipe off maybe $300 million of exports, because that barley will have to be placed in alternate markets at a slightly lower price. From an Australian macroeconomic point of view, this is almost nothing. It's less than 0.1% of national exports. Very tiny movement in the Australian dollar is worth far more than that. And indeed, we've talked about the US-China trade war. If you think about the effects of the Trump's tariffs on the Chinese steel industry for Australia's iron ore and met coal supply, I almost guarantee you that's rubbed off more than $400 million of exports for Australia. So if we're just adding that up. But the thing is, if you're in the West Australian barley industry, that's 30 to 40% of your revenue this year. So from a macroeconomic point of view, the country can blink. If you're a WA barley farmer out of East Geraldton, that's a huge hole punched through. And what that does is it really, I think what we really need to think about, particularly in a context with this, well, I would, when I said in my strongly worded op-ed that this was targeted at farmers, is this isn't a national cost. This is being felt by certain parts of the Australian economy. If you're in cotton, if you're in barley, this hurts a lot. If you're in the federal treasury, it's almost nothing. And I think when we have those risk discussions, there's a risk assessment exercise that economists like us can spend all day on spreadsheets doing. But the political discussion is when Australia finds itself in this new situation, do we do as a country in terms of thinking about how we manage that risk, both in the economic costs, who pays, what do we do about it, who is it beholden on to do something about that, what does doing something mean? They're complex political discussions that go far beyond simply saying, oh, well, you know, the China relationship is now politicized. That's trivial. What's an interesting discussion for us to have is how are we going to manage that? And Australia's never had to deal with this in my lifetime, let's be honest. But, you know, maybe some very senior, I know there's some quite esteemed people on the call today may be able to remember the trade wars in the 70s, but I'm too young for it.
Look, Jeff, I had a prepared follow-on question, but I'm keen to pick up on what you just talked about, in fact. So in terms of that political management of these economic, you know, the weaponization of economic links, how do you think Australia is handling that? For example, I know in the past you've talked about, you know, the danger of business groups lobbying the Australian government effectively on behalf of the Chinese government. They're doing it for their own interests, but in wanting to maintain their relationship with China, that's what they engage in doing. So when you're looking at businesses at the moment, is that what you're seeing, or are you seeing businesses actually sort of stepping back here and saying, yeah, actually, we may just want to be a bit quieter here rather than go on the front foot and lobby the federal government to change their foreign policies on the South China Sea or Hong Kong or whatever else?
Look, this is a really invidious challenge for a country like Australia, particularly an open society. On the one hand, there's a number of different sectors that have borne the brunt of what's happened this year. And, you know, in a society like ours, I see no problem with whether it's barley or cotton or, you know, rumours about dairy and wine coming up, who knows what's next, saying this is harming our members. And quite rightly, these companies are in this position because they have done the right thing by the country for the last decade, which is develop a really important trade and investment relationship with China that's promoted exports, investment, jobs, all of that kind of stuff. So they can feel some political decisions in Beijing and Canberra that have nothing to do with us getting on with it have then injured our business. On the other hand, there is a downside to then saying that because it creates a cycle of internal political machinations. And look, I can see who we have on this call today. I'm sure we've all been following it daily. There's a lot of heat and not a lot of light in these recriminations and accusations of being too close to Washington or too close to Beijing or all of this kind of stuff. And to some extent, it probably saying less in the public sphere might help manage the situation politically. But I say that very, very cautiously, because if it's my business, my livelihood that's affected by this, I wouldn't want anyone to come out of this thinking the solution is to just shut up and bear it. I think what we need to think about in Australia, because this is, again, this is a context, we haven't faced trade war since the 70s or really on a wide scale the 1930s. We really need to think about how we're going to have that discussion, both in a policy sense and the corporate sense, but also a societal sense, because some of the comments on both sides I'm seeing in the newspapers are not particularly helpful from either direction.
And that's an example of the restrained commentary I'm used to hearing from you, Jeff. Okay, David, let me go to you now with a follow-on question in the investment space. I've sort of looked a bit forward with Jeff, and I'd kind of like to do the same with you around investment. It was very interesting when I read your AFR op-ed in the middle of the year. You quoted Tony Abbott introducing the Chinese president Xi Jinping to the Australian Parliament. This was back in 2014. And here's what Abbott said. I'll just read it out for our audience. "We trade with people when we need them, but we invest with people when we trust them. A relationship might begin with commerce, but it rarely ends once trust has been established, as I believe it has between Australia and China." I mean, my goodness, extraordinary comments. And sitting here in 2020, it's hard to even imagine those comments were ever made. And this is, by the way, this is something I hear a lot from my American colleagues. They will say, "Oh, well, the reason America is our #1 source of foreign investment and the most prominent destination for Australian investment abroad is because there's that fundamental trust that underpins the bilateral US-Australia relationship." So, David, are we basically doomed? I mean, I don't think, as Diane said, it's a bit of a stretch to say that there's deep trust between Australia and China in 2020. What's the outlook?
Well, look, I think the outlook from an official point of view is that the government has hardened its stance on Chinese investment. I think there is strong, as I was saying earlier, strong national security input into that hardening, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. So I think that is a feature. At the same time, the other sort of half of Tony Abbott's he was always quite good at capturing the essence of something in a simple phrase, is that we trade with people when we need them. And I think that you will still see people trading because they need each other. And maybe, take it a step further. I think you do get investment, but where people see a commercial opportunity. I'm getting back to your earlier your question to Jeff as to whether people are pricing in risk. I think that it is always very difficult for business to really price in, put political risk on one side of the ledger and commercial return on the other, and come up with some kind of an equilibrium or find tipping point one way or the other. Generally, if a business can see a buck, it'll chase it. And I think that in the Australian business community, they still see China. It's going to be a massive, it is a massive power. It will remain a massive power out into the indefinite future. And they will see opportunity there and they will attempt to take it. And similarly, I think you will see Chinese business looking for opportunities in Australia and will endeavour to take it, notwithstanding the more forbidding political circumstances that surround it.
I want to go to Diane next, but actually I'm just going to quickly jump back to Jeff, very, very quickly, Diane, then I'd like to follow up with you. Jeff, David raises this very interesting point about the China opportunity hasn't disappeared. So I think we're all comfortable with the idea that the risk in the China relationship has increased. So even if it's difficult, I hear more and more businesses talking about mitigating that risk. But in the end, Jeff, do you see Australian businesses, do you see changes in the pattern of trade going forward? Or is it simply the reality that even as businesses do the right thing and factor in increased risk, the bottom line is that the opportunities of China are still so much greater than the alternatives that they're they've still got every incentive to sell to China. Just, I'd be interested to get your quick assessment on that. Then I'll come back to Diane.
And I think from a business perspective, it depends on where you sit with respect to these risks at the moment. I mean, many of the people on this seminar would have heard some of these calls for decoupling from China. And I think this is very overblown. It comes from some very aggressive US commentators on this, and it won't work. It doesn't make any sense. And no one's seriously talking about that in Australia. But it would depend on who you are. So for some of the industries affected, if you're barley, 80% to China. If you're the cotton sector, I think it was 71 last year. And you're thinking about what your future growth strategy is, you're probably going to price that risk and say, we have a lot of eggs in one particular basket. The next bets we make in terms of an export strategy to the region probably need to be somewhere else. That's just good business sense under normal circumstances. And it's certainly what's happened in 2020 with the breakdown in the Firewall refines that. But, you know, as David points out, there's a number of Australian sectors that are woefully underexposed in terms of their trade and investment relationships with the region. And there's no reason they shouldn't or won't be thinking about making further steps in that direction. I'll just start with a basic macroeconomic statistic is that China's about a sixth of the global economy and about a third the Indo-Pacific economy, if you think of that as Australia's trade patch, so to speak. There's therefore, for an industry with complementarity with China, there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't say about a third of your exports should macroeconomically be to China. That would be a reasonable exposure. But it's when you have issues like barley where it's 80% that then these kind of things really become a problem, and they need to start thinking about an Indonesia or a Vietnam kind of option. This would equally be true of industries that are highly exposed to the US economy as well, I might add.
Just ensuring your reputation for balanced commentary there, Jeff. Well done. All right, Diane, I might go to you next. Diane, in Australia, again, I'm sorry to put you on the spot as being the person to give us the perspective from China. It's a bit unfair, but while I've got you in front of me, I can't resist doing that. In Australia, we often hear this assessment about China that whereas, 10 years ago, we were all comfortable with the idea that pragmatism was at the heart of China's, at least its economic policies. Right? So yes, we understand the nature of the Chinese Communist Party, but when it came to economic policy settings, pragmatism ruled the roost. There is increasing talk in Australia these days of a bit of a shift there. That is, the Chinese government is becoming more ideological in its outlook. For example, increasingly putting Chinese Communist Party cells, decision-making cells, into private companies, for example. That the Chinese public is being increasingly fueled by nationalism. I'm not saying any of these are correct, by the way. I'm just giving you the description that we often hear in Australia. That the Chinese Foreign Ministry is hypersensitive to geopolitical competition with the US. I'm sure you'd be familiar with the term wolf warrior diplomacy. So just a question for you, Diane. I should invite our audience members, by the way. Feel free to type in questions into the Q&A tab and I can go to the audience next. But while we're doing that, Diane, in your view, when you look at economic policy making in China, is pragmatism still, and delivering those increasing living standards to the Chinese population, is that still at the heart of policy making, or has there been a shift?
Thank you, James. I'm sorry for disappearing a little while ago. It's because of the Wi-Fi connection. That's why Australia needs 5G. And this is so important.
You're not going to get a plug-in for Huawei there, are you, Diane?
And really, I mean, for your question, the funny part about it is that what you said about being ideological in outlook, fueled by nationalism, hypersensitive to geopolitical competition with the US and all this. Maybe not the last one, but pretty much the same thing can be said about Australia from, some of the more extreme Chinese media. So I think that's the bigger picture here. And I mean, before I just move on to talk about the decision-making pragmatism in China, and I just want to touch a little bit on the situation that I have observed in Australia, and it's pretty much a continuation of what David said just now. And it's really a little story. So 2 years ago, in September 2018, I was sitting in a meeting between a top Australian university and an NDRC think tank. So as you know, NDRC does economic planning for China. So at the meeting, I asked a very respectable former Australian official, former head of ONA. I asked him, well, is this growing dominance of growing dominance of the security voice in Australia, is this a blip or is it something lasting? So he just paused and he said, I don't know. And then, I mean, the funny part about it is that 2 years later, and look at where we are now. I mean, I just want to continue a little bit with what David said just now about the proposed foreign investment reform. I mean, this is really, when you look at it, I mean, in addition to a little bit of a streamlining and transparency, everything is security. And this is that particular part about information sharing with other agencies and with other countries. I mean, it looks like it's really a highly securitized piece of legislation, but led by the Treasury. And of course, we all saw that coming when David Irvine replaced Wilson in the firm. So that was really has been a trend for now. But back to China, and I would like to say that my observation would be in the policy making, this always pragmatism, and pragmatism is definitely the most important part because as we Chinese like to repeat about the Marxist theory that economics or survival would be the fundamental thing for everything. And including the sectors like the businesses and the common people, I think there's always room for them, for all these pragmatic voices. And businesses in particular always have their voices heard, and just through one way or another. But the point about it for Australia to understand is that their concerns or their voices may not necessarily about a single market. And as many of my colleagues have said that for many things, Australia can be replaced. And this is one little part that is a little bit for the Australian counterparts to understand, is that because the Chinese enterprises have to survive in a highly competitive market, and also the governance culture is quite different from here in Australia, the companies are really, really sensitive about the direction of policy. So it can be incentive, it can be restriction and everything. So I think that's what I see about that. And also I want to add at the very end, you said, I think a voice does matter, but sometimes a voice may be loud, but we Chinese like to say action speaks louder than words. So I always want to show appreciation to all these common Chinese and Australians who work so hard to build the economic activities and people-to-people connections. I think the robust economic numbers say everything.
Thank you, Diane. Look, we've just got a question come in that I'll put to the panel. This reminds me of a comment that our Angus Houston made recently. He was a former boss of Australian Defence Forces. So John Tan asks the panel, is it possible that China, probably this is more to you, Diane, is it possible that China now considers Australia a hostile power and is trying to reduce its dependence on Australia? Actually, it's a good question. It's a really good question, because in Australia, I guess the inclination is to look at China, see China as being a risk. So the discussion in Australia is all about diversifying away from China. But Diane, what's your assessment on that in China? Does China now look at Australia as a hostile power, perhaps in cahoots with the United States, which is clearly a strategic rival, and that's giving China every incentive to diversify away from Australia?
Thank you, James. I think part of the pragmatism we were talking about, I think with every country, I think China has the same concern as well, is that for supply of certain goods, you don't put all the eggs in one basket. Of course, I mean, it always makes sense. It makes sense to Australia, it makes sense to China. So definitely reducing over independence is always a good idea with any country. About China's idea of Australia as a hostile power, I'm not sure whether hostile is the right word, but as I said, I think what Australia has to deal with now is this really a huge disappointment on the part of China. And I think this is a bit of emotional and getting not, doesn't sound too economical, but I think this is in the depths of the thinking of many Chinese and also many Chinese officials, is that the anticipated economic connections, the people-to-people connections would bring to more goodwill, but it didn't happen. So for investment and with many other things, I think you can see that Australia has, if I have to term it, I would say unnecessarily proactive. So I would agree with the former Foreign Minister, I think, from Singapore, who said that Australia needs to be more confident in that it wouldn't be so anxious about the so-called looming threat and things.
Thanks, Diane. Jeff and David, just a quick word from you, if I may. You may have seen Angus Houston's comments just a few days ago where he said, let's be clear, China is our partner, it is not our enemy. Jeff, how do you think Australia is looking at China at the moment?
Confused. What we've certainly seen in China's foreign policy behaviour this year is something that we haven't, and you mentioned this in earlier comments about where a great power will now behave like one, James, is a kind of behaviour from China that Australia has never seen or dealt with before. It is coming. 2020 has been an utterly febrile year. Coronavirus, all of the economic and political consequences of that, the dumpster fire that is the hopefully dying days of the Trump administration. This has not been a great year for anyone, and tensions are right high. And what we have seen certainly in that time is a stepwise change in the way China conducts its foreign diplomacy, that certainly in Western countries where you can see Twitter accounts of Chinese foreign ministry officials, like we criticise the Trump administration for using deranged language. Well, we've seen some pretty wacky stuff out of the Global Times this year as well. It's very hard to make sense of this. And there's a constant debate in Australia about, well, what does this mean? Are we in the doghouse forever? Is this well, we're burning you, Australia? Is this a kind of show of force for a little while until things calm down? Once we all get over, the thing that let's all be clear about what catalysed this Chinese eye was Australia's call for independent international investigation into the origins of coronavirus. Once that goes through the digestion, will this pass at some point, just kind of its own accord? No one knows the answers to that. And I certainly don't. I think that reflects political machinations within China's decision-making structure that are opaque to even many policymakers in China, let alone us here in Australia. And I think what we've kind of seen, we don't need to go through the gory anatomy of the debate we've had in Australia over the last 6 months, but I think what we've seen in the partisanship and the rhetoric and vitriol and that is really a group of people who don't know what to make of any of this mess. And in that confusion, all kinds of crazy ideas come through the nothing to see here, through to the China is the evil empire kind of spectrum on the discussion. It possibly is too soon to tell, but there really is just confusion as to, we understand what's happened this year, but we don't know what that means in the long term, and I don't either.
Thanks, Jeff. David, any quick comments from you in terms of how you think Australia views China? We're running out of time, but I would like to hear your quick thoughts.
Look, just very quickly, I think that Australia is in many ways a strategic taker, not a maker. So I think that Australia's relationship with China will be significantly influenced by what happens between the US and China. If we wind up with a Biden administration, many people are saying, well, look, there is a bipartisan view, a largely bipartisan view in the US that is hostile to China and you shouldn't expect much change. On the other hand, some people are suggesting that Biden would look for areas of cooperation and collaboration with China on climate change, for example. I think if you wind up with a more constructive relationship between the US and China, then that might create some grounds for some steadying in Australia's relationship with China. On the other hand, if the US continues to harden as it has over the past couple of years, I think it will be very difficult for Australia to see Australia independently pursuing any kind of rapprochement with China. And just one final little thought is that I do think that I think it's striking that Xi Jinping was very personally involved in the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. He came to Parliament, he signed with Tony Abbott, and it was the most advanced free trade agreement that he'd ever signed, and I think it's Diane might correct me, but I think it's the last significant free trade agreement that China signed. I think Australia has, you hear Chinese people talking about the incredibly long history of constructive relationship between Australia and China. So I do think that on the Chinese, my sense is that on the Chinese side, while there is disappointment, as Diane says, there is also some sort of residual goodwill that remains.
Okay. Thanks, David. I'm glad you touched on climate change just very briefly there, because we do have another question that asked that. But unfortunately, as is always the case with these very quick webinars, we're running out of time. Look, folks, I'm going to ask you a question and I just want your 30-second response. Here it is. Has the high water mark of the Australia-China relationship already been achieved? Or is it possible to imagine that in 2030, the trade and investment relationship might be better than now? Yes or no? And give me your one data point that leans you in one particular direction or the other. Diane, let's start off with you.
Thank you, James. I would say that without a fundamental shift in the status quo, that's big power relations, change of leaders, and prioritization, or just approaching foreign policy, I think the low trust is likely to continue for the foreseeable future. But I would say that investment is going to be tricky because, as we have seen, investment has always been driven by mega deals, which now are becoming so sensitive. Trade, I think you were sustain, but I'm a bit worried about education and wine. I'm going to stop there.
David, what's your assessment?
Yeah, well, 10 years is a very long time and a lot can happen. But if you're to make your judgment based on the way things are going, I would say yes, we have passed the high water mark, and it was probably around 2014 when Xi Jinping spoke to the Australian Parliament.
Jeff, is there any sunny optimism in Perth, or are you going to align yourself with David?
The sun always shines in the Golden West. Look, I'd split that politically and economically. I'd go back on the political side, David, I'd probably go back to 2009 for a political high water mark. But I think economically, the high water mark was 2019. 2020 certainly won't be. I would struggle to see a situation where we're above a 2009 or 2014 level on the political front by 2030. And that firstly, that's due to the uncertainty we've discussed, the role of the US, the trajectory of global politics. China and Australia are very different. It would be amazed, we should really be profoundly disturbed if there wasn't issues there, really, for both our countries and our systems. Economically, though, the things that drive us together remain in place. The Indo-Pacific, our region, will bounce back from Corona faster than any other region of the world. And as Asia's factories and service sectors and universities power back up, the underlying factors that drove Australia and China economically to a high watermark last year are just going to keep powering. So if we can plug the hole in the damn wall between politics and economics, I think it's eminently possible.
Thanks, Jeff. All right, let me go to my colleague, Michael Joel, to wrap things up today.
Thank you, James, Diane, David, and Jeffrey. Members of the audience will be sending an email to everyone here asking for your thoughts on how this webinar went. If you could please fill out that feedback form, we'd really appreciate it, and we can make future UTS ACRI events a better experience for everyone involved. If you wanted to know more about the Australia-China relationship and about our research, more details are available on our website at australia-china-relations.org. The discussion today is also available there. Please follow us on Twitter for the latest news at ACRI_UTS. Thanks again to our speakers, James Lawrenson, Diane Hu, David Uren, and Jeffrey Wilson. And thank you to all of our attendees. See you next time.